Hello and welcome to another episode of Medtech Adventures. I'm your host Scott Phillips, and this is a show where we profile really entrepreneurs, innovators, and builders of the medtech sector, and it's always a lot of fun. And today my guest is the legendary Stan Rowe, who's a real interventional cardiology pioneer, and he's done some remarkable things, both with stents, with valves. What could be more impactful in that sector than those major innovations, both on technically and also commercially and clinically, of course. So without further ado, here's Stan, and let's get into it.
Yeah, thank you, Scott. Thanks for having me here. Really nice.
It's a total pleasure.
Don't think of myself as a legend, more of a nerd, maybe an interventional cardiologist.
A legendary nerd. Someday I hope to be a legendary nerd too. Great. So as we get going, let's just think a little. I'm very interested in how did this all start? Tell us a little bit about your beginnings as a nerd and in the context of.
Well, I think I grew up in a very nerdy environment, and you don't think of Alabama as a nerdy environment, but mine was. My father worked for NASA. He's one of the NASA scientists involved in the space program. He was a physicist by training, and my mother taught school. But, you know, we never joked with one another that, you know, it takes a rocket scientist to do that, because everybody's dad was a rocket scientist, right?
That was normal.
So, yeah, it was. Actually went to school with Werner von Braun's children.
Oh my gosh.
And so, yeah, it just was a very nerdy environment, but it was also one, if you think about it from an entrepreneurship perspective, thgoing guys had huge vision. This started, of course, with John F. Kennedy, you know, the moonshot, that we're going to do something big and bold and impactful that no one's ever done, and we're not sure we know how to do it, but we're going to figure it out.
Wow. That's
what they did, right? Building, you know, the Saturn rocket from the Jupiter rockets, and figuring it out along the way.
Yes.
There was no blueprint.
Right.
And so I grew up with static test firings in Huntsville, Alabama, that would, they would shake the earth for 100 miles from the booster tests. And it was just normal. I mean, that's what my childhood was like. And, but I do think it influenced the way I think, that I saw what that generation did, what big thinking resulted in. People making bold objectives and then working hard, even through lots of failure, to make it work. So there were a lot of lessons in my growing up that I think really influenced me, that I had to think about later, right, about how that environment really affected me. And maybe I was asked to come back to the university and speak before their graduation, and it really made me reflect upon that substantially. And it was real privilege and fun to talk to graduating.
To think about, you know, space race, Cold War, this sort of but how the thinking that was involved in that could actually echo in medical technology. That's something that nobody was thinking at that time, right?
Yeah, but I do think it influenced me. I don't know if it influenced others, but I grew up with that. And so the idea of just, you know, I value incremental development. I know that it can really help. Generational development's great, but what I've always had a passion for and really enjoy the most is, you know, trying to hit the home run, really, you know, doing things that change the practice of medicine. And those are much harder and have many tougher obstacles. But that's where I started. And then when I graduated, I went into the pharmaceutical industry for a while. And
just say, what did you study
engineering? So I'm a biologist by training, actually, right? Yes.
Yeah.
And did some graduate work in cellular biology and stuff, and I was pretty nerdy. And when I went into the pharmaceutical industry, I was very into understanding mechanisms and all the biology of everything. And I really enjoyed it, but you know, after quite a few years, what's interesting about pharmaceuticals is what can you vary? Right? I can vary dosage, route of administration, carriers, not much else, right? And so your ability to actually innovate in pharmaceuticals is very narrow. It's based upon a molecule that you're trying to understand its characteristics. And I learned a lot. I ran clinical studies, involved in marketing as well, and learned a lot from that experience, but I really wanted to go into med device. And so I made that big jump many years ago and moved into product management. And I liked the idea of product management because it exposes you to the breadth of developing a product. You're involved from manufacturing through marketing and obviously R&D in between. How do I define the next generation of product? It's a great place to learn, and I felt like I learned a lot through that process. So I've ended up spending about half of my career in marketing and half in R&D. And I find that extremely useful, and I'm involved in a lot of biomedical engineering departments around the country over the years, and I tell students, I say, most products don't fail because they fail technically. You know this guy. They fail because we don't really understand customer requirements or competition or, things that are more business related. How do I define a product that really meets the needs of the customer and inspires physicians and patients want it? Defining that product is difficult, and I think many biomedical engineers think, I just follow a blueprint and make something and it'll be successful. And I think that's where a lot of people fail. And so that integration of understanding the medicine and understanding the competition and where things are going, not just where they are today, but 7 years from now when I launch the product, what's it going to look like? Defining that is half of the story. And then the other half is implementing it so that it actually does perform at the highest standard. And those are challenges we constantly face, I think, in innovation.
So that's really interesting. So that you actually would jump from pharma to product management within pharma, I guess, and then to medical device. That's not actually a very normal career path. They go from marketing to more technical.
Yeah, I think I guess I've always had this passion for both sides of that. I don't think you can do R&D as well if you're not really focused on some of those softer things like the product definition. And this, think about the way we used to do it, Scott. It didn't make sense, right? So we would say, okay, marketing, your job is to go out and talk to customers, find out what they want, bring it back, and hand it over to R&D. And then R&D would go back into their shop and try to make something that marketing had defined. And of course, mostly what marketing would define is something that was completely impossible to build, right? This perfect product, right? So R&D would go back and go, we can't do that. We can do this. And they'll go back to marketing and say, okay, well, is this okay? And that back and forth makes no sense, right? So the idea that you eventually come to, I think, is that you have to have the R&D people really understand the customer needs. And the marketing person is the facilitator of that, right?
Absolutely.
And so their job, I think, is to teach the R&D people and define this broader product that's competitive across different cultures, different countries, all those things, right? That meets not just one doctor's needs, but a whole lot of doctors' needs. To have the R&D group really understand that, then they can make those trade-offs better, right? In collaboration with marketing. That old idea didn't work, and yet we did it for decades, and it was just so inefficient and so ineffective. So I think that's where that integration creates real value is, you know, I want biomedical engineers, I talk about a three-legged stool, that I want them to understand the biomedical engineering. Yeah, be great at that, right? Then you have to understand the medicine, right? And I mean, the procedure, the patients, the outcomes, the standard of care, how the physicians think and make product selections, the history of what you've developed, right? So really understanding that medicine deeply, and then understand this business of innovation, which is understanding patents, understanding competition, understanding medico-economics, understanding how do I strategize development so that it's efficient, you know, and then the economics behind it. So if you think about it, we have a really big charge. I used to tell Mike Masala, my boss at Edwards, I say, I can never really be good at my job because all I have to know is, you know, all the biomedical engineering around heart valves and critical care medicine, and I have to know all of the medicine around cardiothoracic surgery and structural interventions. And then I have to understand all of this, you know, how to innovate, you know, in a multi-billion-dollar company. And if you think about that, it's a big charge, but also it brings a perspective of we have to be constant learners, right? So I could never be good at my job, but I'm working on it. I'm trying to learn all those three things. And if I get better and better at it, then I'll be maybe a little bit more effective. So I think, you know, that's one of the things I try to convey to biomedical engineering students who want to do innovation is that breadth of understanding is really important. And I think some of that background from product management, you know, and spending time in marketing and then in R&D has been helpful. And
that's remarkable. So it's almost the benefit of you having had a corporate career to get that breadth of exposure that really gave you the toolkit to do entrepreneurship, but it takes a special personality to take that kind of risk on after you get accustomed to the sort of the security of the corporate environment.
Well, the corporate environment, I would say, let's not forget how important the training opportunities are in that corporate environment, right? That they invest a tremendous amount in training young people and training their existing employees. And so if you're interested in that, it's a tremendous opportunity. I went through J&J's advanced management courses, and it was tremendously helpful to me in my career. It was like a mini MBA, right? But much more focused and much more practical. So, you know, I think I encourage anybody who's coming out of biomedical engineering to go spend several years with a big company and learn the business, right? It's a great place to learn and take advantage of all of those training opportunities. You may want to stay there or you may want to branch out into entrepreneurship, but most entrepreneurial companies can't afford to train people.
Absolutely.
Right? And so we need experienced people who have spent time in industry to learn.
Great insight. So let's jump over to a couple stories now. Maybe it's a good time to jump over to how you got into the stents space.
Well, I had worked with, after doing product management, I ended up at Cordis Corporation. I was actually director of marketing there, and they were in diagnostic cardiology and could see the early days of interventional coming. And this is where balloon angioplasty was at its forefront. And so I used to go attend the Emory courses, which were the big angioplasty courses. And so we started developing tools in that area, balloon catheters, guiding catheters, guide wires. And so that was a great introduction for me to go spend time in those cath labs and understand the products and defining even those basic tools to be competitive. And so, you know, I got exposed to that early on. And then an opportunity arose for me to go back to Johnson & Johnson, where I'd spent my pharmaceutical years, to work on stenting.
So J&J had decided to innovate in stents at that time?
Well, it was an interesting thing. I mean, and I haven't seen J&J do this very frequently, but what they did was they bought this technology very early. They actually bought it out of Ethicon, their division, and then they spun it into this small, very small company called JJIS, Johnson & Johnson Interventional Systems Company. Put a very talented young CEO at the time, or I guess mid-career CEO, Marv Woodall, in charge. I think when I started, there were 30 people in the company. I'm not sure any of them had interventional cardiology experience, which was pretty funny, right? Yeah. They're all trying to learn this. Yeah. But they had licensed the stent technology from Pomaz and Schatz for quite a bit of money. So they put that at risk to do that license. And, but Julio Pomaz and Dick Schatz they were partners with us, right? And they had every incentive to be partners with us.
So they had licensed in, they came with it, and they were now employed by them?
Yes, yeah, because they had a royalty arrangement that was quite lucrative, and so they really, and of course, this was their passion. They wanted to see it become a real product. I think so many people see product development as, well, gee, this is a great way to make money, but most entrepreneurs really want to see their products have an impact on patients, right? And I've known people who made a lot of money and their product was shelved and they were frustrated as they could be. It wasn't about the money, it was about having an impact, right? And you know, these guys were remarkable. Dick Schatz is a very talented cardiologist. Julio Pomaz is an interventional radiologist by training.
Which was in its infancy as a industry at that time. He
was at the University of Texas San Antonio, practicing there when he brought them the idea of the stent. And they were, I think their committee looked at, do I invest in filing this patent as either this stent idea, or it was something about monitoring mice brains or something, and they chose the monitoring mice brains, and they said to Julio, we don't want to invest in this. Right. So he had to go out and find funding to file his patent.
Well, as a clinician.
As a clinician.
Yeah.
And he was generous enough to actually still give a portion of the royalty back to the University of Texas San Antonio, who had refused to file one of the biggest patents in the history of med devices, right? So much for the wisdom of tech transfer.
Yes, we've seen that in Full Display and a few other occasions. Yes,
yes, I know.
Yeah, it's a tough job that they do with limited budgets often. So,
but Julio's not your average interventional radiologist. I mean, as talented as he is as a physician, he's a mechanical genius. I mean, the guy, as a hobby, he would buy race cars that had raced, had been disassembled, were put in boxes, and he would buy them in boxes, bring them home. As long as I had the blueprints, he would reassemble them, okay? Wow. And if there were missing parts, he'd machine them.
Amazing.
How many people do you know can do that, right? He had a garage full of these amazing cars. And so he's the guy that actually, when he built these stents for the first time, he was welding the joints together. Oh my So pretty remarkable.
These tiny, tiny little welds. This is not car scale. This is like microscope scale.
Right. I know.
Yeah.
I know.
Interesting.
And of course, you know, he wasn't the first one to think of stents. You know, I think the wall stent actually preceded it, but it was not a very good stent for most usage. It was ended up being okay in the peripheral vasculature, but for coronary use, the idea of a balloon expandable stent that used plastic deformation of metal as a basis, and that is, of course, it's like I always describe it like a coat hanger. If you open up a coat hanger a little bit, it springs back, but if you open it up too far, it'll stay open, right? And that's the plastic deformation of metal, and that's kind of what happens with the stent. You make it really small, and you exceed the deformation limits, and it stays expanded. But those were, you know, that was a remarkable design. I always say anybody can make something stupidly complicated. It takes genius to make it simple. Absolutely. And this was very simple. It provided 90% open area in the area that it covered, which made it less thrombogenic. It was still strong enough to exclude the atheroma in the blood vessels. And it ended up being, you know, the dominant form of stenting in coronaries for decades. Right?
And how, you know, so you had this technology, you had an ambitious doctor, maybe a little bit of clinical evidence. So how did that go as a entrepreneurial venture, you might say?
Yeah, it definitely was an entrepreneurial venture, and I give J&J huge credit for doing that kind of thing, and I would encourage them to do more. Because they really created a huge franchise there over time. But, you know, the level of evidence was pretty modest. They'd only done animal studies. They'd never been in first in human when J&J bought them, and it took them a while to go and do that. And that was a rocky road. I mean, when we develop products, it's typically not just a product itself. You have to develop a procedure.
Yes. And
with that procedure comes, you know, how do I image it? How do I medically treat the patient? Who benefits? Yeah. There are a lot of simple but very complex questions around that. Yeah. And we certainly faced that when we did that early development with coronary stents. And people, you know, if you think people were open to that idea, Scott, not all of them were, I can tell you. Balloon angioplasty, people were pretty enthusiastic about. They had spent years developing it. Yeah. But the problem with balloon angioplasty was to get a good result, you had to injure the artery just the right amount, the Goldilocks effect, right? Yes. I have to do it just enough, but not too much, right? In other words, the best outcome meant I had small dissections in the artery. But a big dissection meant I have to call up the cardiothoracic surgeon who thinks this is a stupid idea to begin with.
Kind of your political enemy.
Have him bail me out.
Right, sure, yeah.
Of a failed angioplasty. Yeah. And that was the worst day in a cardiologist's life. Right, sure. To call up the surgeon to bail him out. Right, sure. And if you remember, if you did angioplasty, you had to have a cardiac surgical unit on standby while you did your case. Right. So that was the state of the art. Yeah. Right? That's how tough it was. So how could you make angioplasty much more replicable, that you could get better results? And that's where the stent came in. But again, with that came baggage, because I had cardiologists tell me, you can't put stainless steel in someone's coronary artery. It will thrombose and they'll die. Right. Okay? And when you hear those kind of objections, you say, yes, that is true, to a degree. Right?
That's
right?
Tricky, very tricky.
Right? I have to have an answer to that question that's a good answer. But in fact, you know, we didn't have a good answer. There was a publication from Europe where they were pioneering a lot of this. in the early wall stent days, they were putting wall stents in coronaries, and they had a 30% thrombosis rate.
Like quickly.
Yeah, the first like weeks,
Yeah.
right? And some of those patients died.
Mm-hmm.
So although it looked promising in some respects, that was a big issue. Mm-hmm. And so that, you know, we racked our brains. We talked to lots of physicians. And of course, what we ended up doing is we overdid it. We threw the kitchen sink at these patients, meaning we gave them aspirin, Persantine, Dextran, heparin, and Coumadin.
Wow.
And then we expected their access site in the groin to close, to thrombose close, right? So
yes.
I'm going to anticoagulate you to death, and then expect your access site to thrombose as it would normally.
Yeah, sure.
And of course, what we traded was a risk of coronary thrombosis for a very high bleeding rate, which was also terribly problematic. So, you know, doing these procedures, getting that right took a long time.
Sounds like it takes a lot of emotional fortitude almost. Like you got to believe. I mean that everybody when you've had a victory, everything seems inevitable. But when you're in the middle of all the uncertainty and the objections, and don't have certainty, like how do you sustain yourself through all that?
Well, I think, you know, that's a wonderful question. I think that's always been a challenge for me in my career, is at least most of the things we've developed, we justified first in human by taking on the sickest patients you can find that don't have good options. These are the ones who need a better answer, where a brand new therapy that no one else has might help them. Yeah. They're also the ones who can crash the fastest and have the worst response. And there's no good answer for that, Scott, right? It's right. In almost, the majority, and I would say the great majority of cases, risk-benefit favors these highest risk patients. And it's a miserable place to introduce a first-generation product.
Right, because you're going to have all sorts of negative outcomes.
That's right. Well, they're on a slippery slope when you treat them.
Right.
Right. So how do you really give a first-generation product a fair assessment in that group? I don't know a better way.
So you're just surrounding yourself with people who are going to be disappointed or angry or whatever with you, and somehow keep things in perspective of where you're trying to go.
Well, the perspective is you have to keep in mind what that definition is. There's a bunch of patients who don't have good options or who don't have good outcomes. And we service them, right? Absolutely. That's what it's all about, is keeping that patient in mind. I know we'll talk about PVT later, but maybe the best way to frame that is what we did. We put up in the PVT office, I had two photos. I had a photo of Tony Lund's mother. He had worked with me at J&J. And she died of aortic stenosis in England, where she couldn't even get balloon valvuloplasty. She didn't have a good option. She was a non-surgical patient, aortic stenosis. I'm sorry, you die of your disease. We don't have anything for you. And then we had Alain Cribier's mother, the inventor, and she was not a good surgical candidate. She was alive, but we were really building it for her and everyone like her. And when you put those up on the wall and you say, okay, this is why we're working, and this is who we're building it for, it helps you through those tough times.
Yeah, it sustains you.
In making those decisions.
All the doubts and the people unhappy about this and that,
I know it's not perfect, we're learning, right?
Yes. Amazing.
So in those early days of stenting, we were learning. There was early experience with thrombosis. We threw the kitchen sink at them in terms of giving them anticoagulation. That overstated what we needed. And then a creative physician, Antonio Colombo, actually came up with the ultimate answer, which was to use high pressure balloons, make sure that you got really good wall apposition. And then he just used a good antiplatelet agent like clopidogrel or the predecessor of that, ticlopidine, to treat those patients, and that was sufficient. Right. We didn't have to use all that anticoagulation, but he pioneered that, and it was courageous for him to do that. But this is where partnering with physicians in that early stage really pays off, because they will draw upon their own experiences and their own observations to make it better. And so having that collaborative relationship and learn the process is so critical to refinement of those procedures. You can also, of course, learn how we need to improve the product itself, but that procedural development is something you can't minimize, because we're not just developing a product. We're trying to figure out which patients benefit and how to do procedures and how to image and everything around it.
So I'm thinking that your background in marketing sort of naturally draws you to think more broadly like that, whereas a more technically trained person might naturally focus on the technical problems, which I'm sure were numerous, and but finding that balance of how do you prioritize your energies.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. I mean, I remember sitting next to one of the top people in R&D at JJIS in the early coronary stent days, and one of the top engineers, and we were watching a case, and he leaned over and he said, "So, is that a coronary case or an iliac case?" Oh. And I thought, how are we ever going to compete if that's our engineering talent?
Then you know what
tell
kind
me
of
what you
surgery
want
it
me
is.
to build, and I'll see what I can build.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that was one of the real shortfalls ultimately of JGIS, is we didn't have internally that capability of iterating this really great design to be competitive long term. That talent didn't exist. Sure. And we tried to buy some of that on the outside. That didn't really work out through J&J management. Yeah. And it ended up being really the shortfall of that group over time. Right. But to your point earlier, I think, today I think biomedical engineering and R&D, they do tend to have a broader scope. That a lot of R&D groups have groups that are just clinical engineering, right? What a great place for biomedical engineers to learn, right? Beyond just how to design a product, but how do I develop a procedure and understand everything around it? And that forces you to go into the medicine. But that's where that three-legged stool, I think, is so important, right? Sure. Being a great generalist, that doesn't mean you don't know these subjects deeply, but that business of innovation, medicine, and biomedical engineering come together beautifully, right, in innovation if you spend the time to learn those three. And you'll never be an expert in all three. Yes, exactly. But taking on that scope, I think, enables you to do some of this tougher innovation where you're not, if you're not following somebody who's done it before, you've got to figure that out. And that's hard. Sometimes it's disappointing. It's almost always challenging. And you have to adapt. You have to be able to collaborate with physicians. And that means I have to be able to speak at their level. Yes. Right? If I can't speak at the level of a interventional cardiologist or a structural cardiologist or a cardiothoracic surgeon, they don't want to spend time talking to me, right?
They've got a lot of pressures in their life, and they don't want to waste time with someone who's
right.
doesn't
I have to
understand.
train myself to be able to speak at their level and understand and interpret what they're telling me that can be useful. And so I think that's, the challenge for an entrepreneur is to operate at a level that enables us to do that. And again, for me, it's not, I never consider myself to be a master in any of that. Yeah. I'm just trying to get better. Yes. And I'll never know enough to be what I consider fully competent.
Well, that sort of humility with boldness is kind of finding the sweet spot there too, right? Yep. So you have to believe that you can get there, and then you can get good enough.
But I believe I can only get there with surrounding myself by great talent, right? Sure. My objective is to be the dumbest guy in the room. I find that remarkably easy to do, Scott. But
I doubt that somehow.
But I do tend to surround myself with some really great talent, and those guys. It's always a team effort, and that's what matters. If you have a great team, no one person can do this. And that includes physician collaborators. We can do remarkable things when we have that.
Right. Amazing.
I always think that, there's so much history of that in interventional cardiology. Think of John Simpson and the biomedical engineers that worked with him to create so many different things. And Tom Fogarty, and there are so many people that have done that where they had a vision and they worked with engineering, and that collaboration developed things that became standards of care and really changed the paradigm, especially in interventional cardiology where physician collaborators have been so prominent.
Sure. So before we jump over to heart valves, tell us the sort of end of the story for you on the stents. How did that go for you at J&J? Well,
I managed that through when we were ready to launch the product, and then I moved over to run advanced technology for J&J, and so I was doing worldwide clinical research and business development and strategy and advanced technology, where we started working on the first drug-eluting stents. Right. And that was an awful lot of fun. I hired the first pharmacologists to come into the company and work with us. Bob Filatico was a very talented guy who I brought over from one of the J&J divisions. And that work ultimately became Hepacoat, which was a great early product, and then Cypher. And we did a lot of that early work, that product definition of we need to retard development, retard elution of drug into the adventitia by creating this multi-layered coating. It was a pretty complex development, but again, ultimately it led J&J to go from, bare metal stents where they lost huge market share to competitors. They came back and won that market share back with the first drug-eluting stents, which had a huge impact on restenosis. And maybe to your point about marketing, I remember making the early proposal to J&J to get funding for this. Yes. And I had been involved in both the stress and Benestant trials, which were the first trials on proving reduction in restenosis. And those were both published back to back in the New England Journal. But I went to our biostatistics group and I said, can you put together a graph for me on what's called late loss? So how much regrowth of tissue do you get? We had angiograms so we could measure that. The late loss of tissue as a function of restenosis. And then what I did was created a theoretical approach that said if I could reduce that late loss by 25% and 50%, what would happen to the binary restenosis rate? I don't know if I've made that clear, but it kind of says, binary restenosis says, I've occluded 50% of the lumen. Right. And that's typically when it becomes symptomatic.
Right.
So the question was if I could reduce that regrowth that always occurs to some extent with a bare metal stent, if I could add a drug that magically reduced it by 25 or 50%, that late loss, how would that affect that 50% restenosis rate? And what it showed was that if I could reduce the late loss with a drug by even like 25%, it reduced binary restenosis to 4%, which was remarkable. And that's what enabled us to invest in it.
That's the simple story that you can present to some financial managers who are trying to make a lot of different decisions in different areas to say,
so here's where we're going.
Yeah.
This is our objective.
Yeah.
And if we can do that, it'll be worth every penny you put into it.
Yeah. Amazing.
So
Bill Hunter from Angiotech has
right.
been one of our speakers as well, and fascinating story.
Guy. Yeah. I will tell you along the way, I mean, if you think that everything was a success, and I told you already that we had real problems with thrombosis and then put in too much anticoagulation, our first run at the FDA was also miserable.
Okay.
Cook had licensed the Gianturco-Rubin stent from Gary Rubin, and they had gotten an indication. They actually had the first approval, but it wasn't for restenosis. It was for treatment of dissection in balloon angioplasty. So we thought, well, gee, the fastest route, we want to do these restenosis studies, which no one's ever done, but the fastest route to approval is go ahead and get an approval for this. We put all of our data together, went into the FDA. They handed us our head.
Really? On what basis?
Rejected us at panel.
Wow.
And J&J almost shut down the whole division. Came this close. And the next day, I was on a plane to Rotterdam to meet with Patrick Sarais, who was running the Benestent study, to try to accelerate the Benestent study and the stress study. So I kind of took over managing those studies for J&J to accelerate them so we could go back and get an approval. Patrick Sarais is just an amazing guy and one of the best clinical trialists, kind of like Greg Stone is today, but in his day, he was by far the most prominent clinical trialist. And he put together a great group of people to do this early work on coronary stents and restenosis. No industry sponsorship, didn't want it.
Interesting.
Right? This is an academic endeavor, right?
Yeah,
this is
sure.
Erasmus University, one of the top, institutions in Europe. So Patrick allowed me to come into their investigator meeting. And I'm sitting there in the back of the room, and he's making introductions, and then he says, and by the way, we have a spy with us today, Mr. Stanton Rowe from Johnson & Johnson, and he's back there in the back of the room. And I said to Patrick, I said, well, Patrick, I'm not here as a spy. I'm here as an emissary.
Very nice.
And what I didn't know, sometimes luck plays a great role. Patrick Sarais' father was an emissary.
You picked it well. Yes.
But we became good friends over the years, and he was a great partner in bringing those trials to the New England Journal of Medicine and ultimately to that first approval for restenosis. But we were turned down at panel the first time, and it was touch and go whether we survived or not.
That's another one of those emotional how committed are we to this, and where's the story going to come good? And
that's right.
Yeah,
that's
remarkable.
Right.
This is the second of a two-part series of an interview with Stan Rowe. He really emphasizes the development of the first percutaneous heart valve. So now a $12 billion industry, and he was really the driver that enabled that to happen. It's a story of entrepreneurial resilience, good judgment, being convincing, and we all know that it turned into a wonderful exit, sold it off to Edwards in 2004 for I think $125 million at the time. Wonderful story, I'm sure we really enjoy it.